Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's live broadcast, Maximizing Medical Affairs Impact Through Strategic Alignment and Collaboration, Best Practice, and Live Benchmarking. I'm Lisa Henderson, Editorial Director of Pharmaceutical Executive, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. We are pleased to bring you this educational web seminar presented by Pharmaceutical Executive and sponsored by Syneos Health. Syneos Health is the only fully integrated biopharmaceutical solutions organization. The company, including a contract research organization and contract commercial organization, or CRO and CCO, is purpose-built to accelerate customer performance to address modern market realities. Created through the merger of two industry-leading companies, INC Research and Inventive Health, Syneos Health brings together more than 21,000 clinical and commercial minds with the ability to support customers in more than 110 countries. Together, they share insights, use the latest technologies, and apply advanced business practices to speed its customers' delivery of important therapies to patients. In short, they are shortening the distance from lab to life. For more information, please visit them on the web at www.syneoshealth.com. So we have a few important announcements before we begin. This webcast is designed to be interactive, and we encourage you to ask questions during the event. You can submit questions by typing them in the Q&A box, which can be found on the right-hand side of your screen. You can enlarge the slide window by clicking on the small green icon in the upper right-hand corner of the slide window, or by hovering your mouse over the lower right-hand corner and dragging the window to the desired size. And these slides will advance automatically during the event. If you have any technical problems viewing or hearing this presentation, please click on the question mark help widget in the dock at the bottom of your presentation window. And concluding today's event, we invite you to participate in a brief survey from our sponsor, and that will automatically appear on your screen. I would now like to introduce today's speakers. We are pleased to be joined today by Lisa Arbogast, Dr. Suma Ramadas, and Dr. Susan Saponcik. Lisa Arbogast is a life sciences executive with over 25 years of experience in developing and delivering strategic business models, solutions, and leading teams spanning both clinical and commercial functions. With global experience bridging strategy and execution, Lisa's focus on solutions has driven improved business performance through developing and deploying new strategies, encouraging cross-functional collaboration, partnering, and creating implementation plans for putting new capabilities and ideas into action. Prior to joining Syneos Health, Lisa served as the Vice President, Life Sciences, and led the creation and execution of an innovative life science professional services business model. Dr. Suma Ramadas brings nearly 15 years of life science industry experience focused on creating, leading, and implementing medical affairs solutions. Suma's passions are strategy, innovation, and optimization on a global level. At Syneos Health Consulting, Suma leads the annual U.S. and APAC Medical Affairs Summits, forums that bring together medical affairs leaders to discuss and exchange issues and ideas faced by the industry today. She has spoken at national and international medical affairs conferences to share her insights and expertise. And prior to joining Syneos Health Consulting, Suma built and led the Global Medical Affairs Initiative at a Fortune 200 company. And Dr. Susan Saponcik is an economist by training and brings 2 decades of experience delivering measurable and impactful business results through global pricing, health economics, and market access initiatives, both as a pharmaceutical company executive and industry consultant. Susan has significant experience aligning R&D, commercial, and operating companies on value proposition optimization and market access strategy, substantiation, and implementation. Susan led global market access consulting practices at several consultancies prior to joining Syneos Health. And in her role at Syneos Health Consulting, Dr. Saponcik is charged with assisting life sciences clients with strategic initiatives to optimize, substantiate, and capture the value of their innovations across dynamic and demanding global market access environments. So thank you all for joining us today, and Lisa, you have the floor.
Great. Thank you, Lisa Henderson, and welcome everyone. My name is Lisa Arbogast, and I'm a Managing Director at Syneos Health Consulting. Last year, we saw an unprecedented number of white papers and conference topics focused on the new role of medical affairs in today's environment. Given the numbers of participants here today, the momentum continues, and rightfully so. So we continue to see a dramatic transformation in the medical affairs role and function, as medical affairs is uniquely qualified to understand the unmet needs and communicate their findings for early development. Now that the industry has validated the new role of medical affairs, we can focus on how you can put this into practice and maximize the impact that medical affairs can have on an organization through strategy, alignment, and collaboration. Our three topics today are informing early development, eliminating crosstalk, and lastly, the medical narrative at the core. As I just mentioned, the transformational role of medical affairs, we actually would like to start out with some of our live benchmarking. We will share the results as we go through our discussion, but please click directly on the screen to submit your answer to the questions. If you're not with a biopharmaceutical company, please select the answer that you think of what is taking place in the market today, not what you think should happen. So with that, here's the first benchmarking question. At what point in the development process does medical affairs start to drive the identification and integration of unmet medical needs into development strategy? A, end of phase 1, B, during phase 2, C, end of phase 2, D, beginning of phase 3, E, during phase 3, F, at the end of phase 3, G, between filing and launch, H, at launch, or I, medical affairs does not drive this process in my organization. So I will repeat that. At what point in the development process does medical affairs start to drive the identification and integration of unmet medical needs into the development strategy? A, the end of phase 1, B, during phase 2, C, at the end of phase 2, D, at the beginning of phase 3, E, during phase 3, F, at the end of phase 3, G, between filing and launch, H, at launch, or I, medical affairs does not drive this process in my organization. So while you are answering the question and we're waiting for the results, we'd like to go ahead and begin to talk about the dynamic healthcare environment, new and emerging stakeholders, the value of innovation, and ensuring that we have the right evidence, the right time. These are some of the factors that I think we can all agree continue to shape the ever-changing landscape. So how can the insights that medical affairs bring in from the medical community during the life cycle help to contribute to this dynamism? And more importantly, when is the optimal time for medical affairs to engage? So, Suma, I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Lisa, and thanks everyone for joining us today. So as we start to think about this, we think about how value is defined and assessed by this ever-increasing and varied group of stakeholders across the entire healthcare ecosystem, as Lisa mentioned. Successful new product development and launch require, like Lisa said, the right evidence to substantiate value and making sure that's available at the right time and shared with the right stakeholders. This need for scientific engagement early in the drug development as well as throughout the commercialization process is critical. Now we come to the role of medical affairs. Historically, medical affairs has been a more reactive support function, and two key activities of medical affairs are bringing back in insights from the community and disseminating medical data. However, from our experience, we've seen that this is often reversed, where the focus is really on disseminating medical information rather than gathering the insights early in development. Medical affairs is well positioned to engage with the medical community and gather these insights that can inform early development. So based on that, we believe that a best practice is for medical affairs to have a much more proactive role in gathering the insights from the medical community to bring back into the organization as well as to disseminate the clinical medical data. This two-way scientific exchange is a catalyst for the organization to proactively understand and incorporate those unmet clinical and medical needs. In fact, in early development, we can make the argument that it's more important of what you hear versus what you say back to the community. One other best practice I would point out here is the definition of an insight. We often see that insights turn into pages and pages of data coming back into the organization, but the true definition of an insight is that it needs to be actionable across the organization. If we have those pages and pages of data, those may not be actionable nor truly insightful.
I think one of the critical elements, Suma, in adding on top of this is that in early development, the value proposition is beginning to be shaped. And it's quite critical that that incremental clinical medical benefit is incorporated in the development plan. It's not only meeting the needs of the regulators and the regulatory thresholds, but understanding that product development success today is about what gets used in the market, getting timely market access and uptake. And there is a need to make sure that that development plan addresses the unmet medical needs that are evolving due to the dynamic environment, and in fact that in order to reach the optimal potential for product launch and development, in fact you have to optimize the development program to reflect the unmet needs and the clinical meaningful use.
That's great. Thank you, Susan. And I'm looking to see if our polling results are ready from our first benchmarking question. So great. As we look at these answers, and we apologize, we do have to scroll down, so we'll do that as well. We see that most organizations, well, it's actually quite a mix. So let's look at this. During phase 2, which is our primary response, it looks like most organizations, or a quarter of the organizations, feel like medical affairs gets involved during phase 2 to bring in those insights from the community. This is great. This is what we see as a best practice, is to bring in medical affairs as early as possible as a strategic partner. As we discussed, those insights that medical affairs can bring in is critical to understand the needs of the medical community, and as Susan mentioned, really fit into the downstream value proposition that will encompass the entire therapy. We also see a number of organizations answering towards the bottom of this, so beginning of phase 3, during phase 3, end of phase 3, between filing and launch, which we've seen quite a lot, so 10%, it's quite a big number as well. And finally, that last one, 6%, where medical affairs does not drive the process in those organizations. Once again, this is a missed opportunity for medical affairs to bring in those insights and start to drive the evidence generation needed throughout early development, as we'll talk, and we'll start to position medical affairs and talk about how we're going to streamline the process through the rest of this webinar. So as we conclude the first section, just to reiterate the best practices we talked about, it's really phase 2 engagement of medical affairs, ensuring that we have a two-way communication, both gathering insights from the community as well as disseminating the clinical information, and ensuring that the insights that are brought in are actionable. Once again, these insights that medical affairs can bring in can ultimately show the value of a therapy across its development and commercialization life cycle. With that, I'd like to turn it back to Lisa Arbogast to talk about our next section.
Thank you, Suma, and thank you, Susan. It's very true, but this is definitely no easy task when it comes to evidence. A holistic evidence generation strategy really assumes that all parts of the organization have visibility and agree to what the evidence that's required across the board. But it also assumes that the entire organization understands who the stakeholders are for each and every function. So keeping this in mind, I'd now like to ask our audience to participate in our second benchmarking question. Again, same rules apply. If you're not with a biopharmaceutical company, please select the answer that closely is associated with what you believe is actually taking place in the market today. So with that, here's the second benchmarking question. Which of the following best describes the manner in which your organization aligns around the evidence needs of all stakeholders? A, there is a centralized evidence grid or matrix that collects the evidence needs mapped to all the external stakeholders. For instance, regulators, HCPs, patients, payers, HTA bodies. B, functions have individual evidence grids or matrices and do take into consideration the evidentiary needs beyond the function's primary external stakeholders. C, functions have individual evidence grids or matrices and do not take into consideration the evidentiary needs beyond the function's primary external stakeholders. And then lastly, D, aside from clinical development, no other function has an evidence grid or matrix where evidentiary needs are mapped to each external stakeholder. I'll repeat the question one more time. Which of the following best describes the manner in which your organization aligns around the evidentiary needs of all stakeholders? A, there is a centralized evidence grid or matrix that collects the evidentiary needs mapped to all external stakeholders, regulators, HCPs, patients, payers, HTA bodies. B, functions have individual evidence grids or matrices and do take into consideration evidentiary needs beyond the function's primary external stakeholders. C, functions have individual evidence grids or matrices and do not take into consideration the evidentiary needs beyond the function's primary external stakeholders. And lastly, D, aside from clinical development, no other function has an evidence grid or matrix where evidentiary needs are mapped to each external stakeholder. Susan?
Thank you, Lisa. As we're benchmarking on the evidence generation strategy, we'd like to highlight how difficult it might be in gaining alignment across the functions. In our experience, developing a holistic evidence generation strategy is challenging in an organization because each function may get involved at a different point in time and defines evidence differently from the perspective of their stakeholders. As we think about substantiating value, each function in the external stakeholders that they're addressing has a different standard or threshold for the evidence that is relevant in addressing the needs of those stakeholders. And on the screen here we have a summary looking at across a number of critical functions in the development and commercialization process, how the external key stakeholders may be thinking about evidence thresholds and requirements. For instance, when you're thinking about early development and meeting the needs of regulators, for the most part, the clinical team is thinking about statistically significant scientific evidence that is generated in double-blind randomized controlled trials. As we've just identified in our earlier discussion, when medical affairs is going out to talk to HCPs and practitioners, they're actually learning far more about what might be medically or clinically meaningful in adopting a new product to address an unmet need. And those needs may not actually be addressed by statistically significant evidence in randomized trials. They may involve some additional information about patient function that's not captured, about patient quality of life, and other areas. From a market access perspective, they're dealing with external stakeholders such as payers and HTA bodies who oftentimes have their own actual definitions of incremental innovation and meaningful innovation. And those have often to do with comparing against a head-to-head trial on a comparator that's not possible for a clinical trial. And they also involve definitions of incremental innovation that may not be captured through a regulatory process. Additionally, as outcomes research is trying to address the needs of patients and caregivers and healthcare providers, there's a need for follow-on information in real-world evidence and long-term clinical outcomes. Obviously, real-world evidence not being captured in the clinical trial and long-term clinical outcomes possibly extending far beyond the duration of the trial. And then commercial needs to put this all, wrap their head around all of it together to understand what is commercially viable, which is some composite of the above. So as each of these functions is talking to each other across the table in how to optimize the development, how to allocate resources, where to put the time, how to manage the messaging strategy, we believe that oftentimes there is this element of what we're calling crosstalk, that people think they're talking about the same product, they think they're talking about the same evidence needs, but each is coming at it from their own functional perspective and oftentimes not being as transparent as possible with what's required in the evidence. What that means is that as the organization is allocating scarce resources and time to meet those needs, because evidence takes money and time to develop, there is probably a better way and a more collaborative way of generating and aligning on that evidence. So one of the critical elements here is that cross-functional alignment on evidence that's meaningful to each stakeholder group is crucial to optimize the time, the money, and the resources that go behind evidence generation. So let's see what our polling results have to say on the benchmarking.
Great. Thanks so much for that, Susan. And I think that was a great commentary on what we're calling crosstalk. Now, with this polling question, we were trying to get at seeing how aligned organizations are on the evidence needs and across all stakeholders. From what we can see here, the first one, 30% of organizations feel like they have a centralized evidence grid or matrix, and it collects the evidentiary needs across the life cycle of the therapy, and it's mapped to all external stakeholders. And some of those stakeholders were mentioned here as well as on the slide that you saw before. This is fantastic to see as organizations are ahead of the curve. These organizations are ahead of the curve. In our experience, we find more organizations on the other answers that you see here. So functions that have individual evidence grids or matrices but may take into consideration the needs beyond the function's primary external stakeholders, we see this as also a majority of 40%. Having visibility and alignment across the organization amongst various stakeholders is definitely a step closer to what we're calling a holistic evidence generation strategy that is forward-looking, thinking about what's needed beyond the regulatory requirements, and keeps the end in mind. As we go down a little bit further in the benchmarking question, the third one, where functions have individual evidence grids or matrices but do not take into consideration the needs beyond the function's primary stakeholders, we see that as around just about 15%. From our experience, this is another common thing that we see, and these data show that some organizations are going past this step but others are not. In general, functions need their evidence grids at different time points along the continuum of the development life cycle, but they have to come together to find the synergies and efficiencies for holistic evidence generation. Otherwise, there's a potential for confounding evidence, contradictory evidence, redundant evidence, gaps in the evidence, which can really result in a waste of time and money and resources. Finally, as the last one shows, another almost 15% say that aside from the clinical development function, no other function has the evidence grid or matrix where they have the evidence needs mapped out to stakeholders. Here, it's showing that some organizations have a way to go, and they're trying to move beyond the table stakes of understanding what's required for regulatory approval and recognizing that regulatory approval is no longer the hallmark of success for a therapy. So as we can see, we hope that more organizations start to move up. But as we start to talk about what Susan alluded to, which is the clinical and medical benefit and how that fits in, and more importantly, how to align it, we'll go to our next session.
Great. And actually, I would like to emphasize at this point that medical affairs can contribute and play a significant role in solving the problem of crosstalk, because the one component of evidence that's necessary for adoption by all stakeholders is clinical medical benefit. As a market access professional and having developed a number of value propositions, we would like to be able to rely heavily upon our medical affairs partner in keeping the medical, clinical elements of the value proposition up to date and reflecting the unmet needs in the marketplace. We would like to view that medical affairs market access partnership as something we refer to as MA squared. And with that, Lisa, do you like to take us into the next section?
Absolutely. Thank you, Susan, for that add. So that was a great discussion on evidence and really the role that medical affairs can play in unifying the organization around evidence. And it's good to see in the diagram and the illustration that sometimes the competing evidence priorities and needs can actually reside in one place. But it seems that the organization needs to tell a clinical and medical story, if you will, and align around this story so that everyone within the organization is consistent in how they think and communicate about the clinical and medical benefit. So let's see how our audience feels that their organizations are doing around being able to tell the story in our final benchmarking question. Once again, same rules apply. And with that, here's our final question. In your organization, which best describes how a medical narrative, so the clinical and medical story, comprised of both substantiated and aspirational medical messages, is developed? A, a cross-functional effort led by clinical development. B, a cross-functional effort led by medical affairs. C, a cross-functional effort led by a commercial function, so new product planning or brand management. D, the medical narrative is developed only within a single function. And then lastly, E, we do not develop a medical narrative. I'll repeat that again. In your organization, which best describes how a medical narrative, the clinical and medical story, comprised of both substantiated and aspirational medical messages, is developed? A, a cross-functional effort led by clinical development. B, a cross-functional effort led by medical affairs. C, a cross-functional effort led by a commercial function like new product planning or brand management. D, the medical narrative is developed only within a single function. And E, we do not develop a medical narrative. Suma?
So while we wait for the results of our final benchmarking question, let's get into the discussion around the medical narrative and how it can be used to pull together and align the organization around the clinical and medical benefit. So what you see here is an example medical narrative. Early insights gathered from medical affairs that we talked about earlier in this webinar can inform on several areas, and you see some of those listed here on the left. including the disease state, the unmet needs, the patient journey, the treatment landscape, stakeholder challenges, etc. The medical narrative is comprised of key messages or concepts that are both substantiated and aspirational, and it helps to position the science of a therapy. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on a couple of words that I said. One, the medical message. So when we think about the word message, we're really thinking about how to contextualize the scientific data within the landscape or the community. It is not the same as a commercial message, which is a substantiated claim about an attribute of a particular therapy. Here, we're really focusing on the science. The medical narrative then really focuses on the relevant points to ensure that the therapy and the science is contextualized for the various stakeholders, some of which are listed out there on the right. The medical narrative acts as the up-to-date view on what is clinically and medically meaningful within the medical community and truly acts as a unifying document and aligns the organization on that clinical and medical need, the evidence needs, the major medical messages, and what is needed across the board within every function, as Susan mentioned a bit ago. More importantly, this unifying document for the organization lays the groundwork for the clinical and medical evidence generation and future communication activities.
One of the areas that's critically important as you move through the development and life cycle process of a product is really the alignment of that communication of the narrative. As you go to market and try to capture the value of innovation, payers and other stakeholders will look back through publications, through the clinical presentations, through conference presentations, and really try to understand the basis of the innovation. By having that medical narrative as the core that works throughout the process, it aligns the organization on knowing the terminology that is going to best represent the innovation, the value of the innovation, the place in therapy, and that alignment as the core element is critically important to all those functions. As I mentioned before, when you think about the value proposition and meeting the needs of external stakeholders, a singular element that is important to everyone is the medical clinical benefit. And in fact, as we go through the market access implementation phase, payers simply are not going to pay for things that don't work or innovation that does not address unmet medical needs. So having that medical narrative at the core, a living document that's updated as evidence is generated, and aligning the organization behind the same narrative or value story is critically important. And with that, I think we probably can take a look at the benchmarking results.
Perfect. Thank you, Susan. So as we look at these results, we see that, let's see, so 40%, we asked once again, which best describes how a medical narrative is developed within each organization. We see a small percentage where it's a cross-functional effort led by clinical development. While we can see why this would be a choice, we would ask here, is the organization thinking beyond the regulatory needs? We've seen that when this effort is led by clinical development, the primary composition of the medical narrative really focuses on the regulatory needs while not necessarily thinking about all the downstream needs and truly the holistic clinical and medical benefit. For answer B, 40%, a cross-functional effort led by medical affairs. This is great to see. And interestingly enough, when we conducted our U.S. Medical Affairs Summit a few months back, we started to see this emerge as a trend. We see more and more that the medical narrative is gaining traction as a main contributor to establishing medical affairs as a strategic partner for the broader organization. C, a cross-functional effort led by a commercial function. So the 30% here, I think you can tell from this webinar that our perspective here is really bringing in medical affairs as early as possible to start with the end in mind, understand what that clinical and medical benefit is by listening to the medical community and doing that as early as possible to lay out the groundwork for the clinical and medical evidentiary needs that are used throughout the organization by every function. Typically, a commercial function comes in a little bit later and may not have the direct line of communication between the medical community and the organization. And the two-way scientific exchange that we talked about earlier has to be medical affairs. For D, the medical narrative is developed only within a single function. So when we think about what Susan said here, medical narratives being developed only within a single function means you may have silos and you may not have the view to the rest of the organization, and more importantly, the rest of the organization, the other functions, do not have the view into the medical narrative. That means if we go back to our crosstalk slide, the key stakeholders that you're addressing with your medical narrative is truly within only one function, which means that you're letting the other stakeholders go, or you have overlapping stakeholders that may be getting different medical messages from the organization. And finally, with the last one, which I'm happy to see is the lowest percentage, we do not develop a medical narrative. As we said earlier, we see the medical narrative gaining traction, but as a best practice, it's more about how to align the entire organization on that medical narrative and ensure that any updates made to the narrative have a function, have a place within the rest of the function. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Lisa to wrap us up so we can get to some of our questions and answers.
Yeah, thank you both, Susan and Suma. So today we really want to leave you with three best practices to walk out of the webinar today. And those three best practices would be medical affairs should be involved in early development and sharing unmet needs. Second, that the evidence generation is a cross-functional activity, but is difficult given everyone is speaking about evidence differently. Lastly, that the medical narrative is the unifying document, the clinical medical benefit across all functions, and medical affairs should create and maintain the medical narrative. We will be, as stated in the invitation, creating a white paper and publishing the results of today's benchmarking along with comments, and we'll be distributing that white paper to those of you that are interested in receiving that. So I'd like to turn it over to Lisa Henderson, and we will begin to conduct our Q&A session.
Great. Thank you so much. Before we get started on the question and answer session, I just want to remind the audience how to submit those questions. You can submit questions by typing them in the Q&A box, which can be found on the right-hand side of the presentation window. And with that, we will start with our first question. So just to set the stage, we had a question from someone in translational research at an academic medical center. So they wondered if medical affairs was the same as regulatory affairs. So Suma, can you comment on that?
Sure. So this is an interesting question to answer as it really depends on where the organization is. So for a clinically led smaller organization, at times they may not have a broader medical affairs organization yet or function yet. So in that case, people within the regulatory affairs function may start to have some of the activities that you would typically find in a medical affairs function. However, from our perspective, we see this as very different. A regulatory affairs function should really focus on the regulatory requirements and the regulatory needs of a therapy, where, as we discussed with the medical affairs, they're really focused on bringing in insights, disseminating data, and looking and supporting the therapy across the entire development life cycle, starting early in development and really moving even beyond launch.
Great, thank you. So also, Suma, another question. What is the difference between your medical narrative and a well-thought-out, well-constructed scientific platform?
So I'm very happy that we got this question because it's one we receive quite a lot. The medical narrative is deliberately succinct. It's really taking the story that you want to tell about a particular therapy within the clinical and medical realm. So you're understanding how to position the science that's happening, how to ensure that the relevant points of your disease state or your unmet medical need all the way down through safety, efficacy, and the other domains that we talked about are going to be considered or messaged. However, what this does not do is tell you what's substantiated. The medical narrative is by design both substantiated and aspirational messages and can be refined to reflect changes in the environment, changes in the competitive landscape, changes in your data, etc. This scientific communication platform houses all of the statements you can actually make that are substantiated by the evidence that you have that is already existing. The scientific platform is almost a database from which you can take exactly how you'd want to word all of your statements. The other point I would make here is that each message in the medical narrative may be required, you may require multiple points of evidence in order to substantiate that one message. Those multiple pieces of evidence would be housed in the scientific communication platform with the depth and rigor necessary in order to substantiate a particular message. Back to you, Lisa.
Excellent, thank you. Oh, thank you, Suma. And so to elaborate, you had said that the narrative was substantiated, and aspirational. Can you explain that more?
Yes. So when we say aspirational messages, we're really thinking once again about how we want to position the science. So in our experience, some of the time, you need to change the conversation that's happening within the community in order to ensure that your therapy or the science of your therapy is contextualized. For instance, if a particular disease is characterized as a hematological dysfunction, but your therapy is looking at organ dysfunction, you may have to change the conversation through medical and clinical data in order to do that. To have that laid out or that story laid out, we use both substantiated and aspirational messages within the medical narrative to align the organization on the direction that you're going. We've seen several examples where organizations or different functions are not aligned on this medical narrative, and you may have a mix of substantiated evidence but not necessarily aligned. You get different messages going out to the community. We say the medical narrative is also our blueprint for the entire clinical and medical benefit. So this blueprint needs to include both things that are substantiated as well as things of the direction that you want to go. To add to this, I would say that the medical narrative acts as a mechanism to understand what evidentiary needs you need to focus on and resource in order to be able to substantiate your entire narrative.
Excellent. So our next question, Suma, for you, how to begin the shift in the organization from commercial focus to medical focus? What could be the first step, since some view medical as not useful since it doesn't directly drive the dollars?
Yeah, so I'll answer this in two different ways. So the two types of organizations we tend to work with is where medical affairs is under clinical development, and very rarely we start to see that, or we've been seeing medical affairs under commercial. But I think what's very important here is that we're starting to focus and drive the scientific, the clinical and medical benefit of a particular therapy. We are focusing on the science, ensuring that we have the right unmet medical needs. We're listening to the community, listening to the patient community, the physician community, and addressing those unmet medical needs is purely medical in nature. When commercial comes in later on throughout the development life cycle, then we're starting to see how to translate that into more commercially minded goals. But for medical affairs, we're really focusing on the medical and clinical benefit to ensure that you have the right therapy for the right patients at the right time.
Okay. And the next question, do you have any tips to ensure that the scientific communications platform is actually used across the organization? Many times we spend months developing specific statements and language, but it ends up as more of a check-the-box activity rather than a useful tool.
Thank you for this question as well. So the scientific communications platform, as we talked about just a few minutes ago, is different than the medical narrative. The scientific communications platform is more downstream than the medical narrative. The medical narrative is a cross-functional exercise to ensure that you have the medical and clinical benefits across the stakeholders from all functions perspectives. I'll reiterate the point that is deliberately succinct because that makes it a much more useful document. More importantly, the medical narrative, and not necessarily the scientific communications platform, which is a substantiated database of statements that you can make, but the medical narrative fits into the broader value proposition. And having that cross-functional alignment is crucial in order to make sure that all of this is plug and play, if you will. And I'll look to Susan to see if she has any more comments on this particular piece of how the medical narrative fits in and is succinct.
Indeed, I'd like to jump in here from a market access perspective because the scientific communication platform is actually a key component or a subsection of a broader communication platform and a broader value proposition. So in terms of best practices, we believe that that cross-functional team and alignment is critically important early so that all of the other functional stakeholders recognize that utilizing that scientific communication platform is essential with the medical profession, as well as in communicating accurately and in a compelling manner the medical clinical benefit across other stakeholders. So I would say best practice is really having an integrated approach to having medical affairs understand how it can align, support, and be a foundational element of other activities such as the value proposition development, the overall communication platform, and in having the other functions recognizing that that's a core element of delivering and explaining a compelling value story. Lisa?
Great, thank you. So the next question is, should a holistic approach be included in the messaging/blueprint to connect patient community and development process and value definition?
Indeed, I think that in general our approach and belief is that a holistic approach is critical to success across the organization in understanding and bringing in the viewpoint of stakeholders as well as aligning the organization in terms of spending time and money on evidence generation and in fact making sure that the communications out to each stakeholder group, while they're tailored to their interests, to their objectives, to the type of language and terminology that's used within each stakeholder group, we have to make sure that they're not inconsistent, that they don't confound each other. So it's only through holistic engagement within the company that we can be sure that there's a compelling, internally consistent conversation with the external community.
And just to add to that, the patient community is very important, and understanding the patient needs is becoming a trend that we see more and more. In fact, there's a couple of organizations that have started to focus on the patient community as one of their primary stakeholders, not just through research or not just through bringing in patients for a couple of activities, but really working with patient advocacy groups, understanding, having patient advisory boards, and really understanding the voice of the patient and how to integrate that voice back into the medical narrative, the early development process, and ensuring that those needs are met on the other side. So we definitely see patients as a primary stakeholder across this clinical and medical benefit.
And the next question, are there other objectives for evidence generation strategy outside of just the broad commercial product development objectives or focus? For example, understanding the burden of disease, or does evidence generation strategy always line up to the product development processes?
So I just want to make sure I understand the question. So we're looking for other objectives for the evidence generation strategy outside product development process. What we've talked about today, a medical narrative, is directly linked to a particular therapy. However, I think it's important to note that the medical narrative does have domains such as disease state and unmet medical need. Now, through the strategy of what's necessary for a therapy, you may need to look outside just the safety, efficacy, or the attributes of a particular therapy to ensure that you're contextualizing the science of the therapy prior to continuing in the development process. This is what we're talking about today. However, from a broader evidence generation perspective, you may consider other needs. And I'm looking to Susan to add to that.
Absolutely, yes. The evidence generation strategy is comprehensive, and I think that that's why we're talking about being cross-functional, why we're talking about it being longitudinal, why we're referencing the dynamism in the market and how much change there is in terms of the number of competitors, the innovation, the proliferation of stakeholders, and indeed within an organization, even the solution development. So as we're going well beyond the solution being a product to an array of services or a way to bring innovation to patients so that they actually benefit, the evidence generation strategy may be incredibly far-reaching. I think as we think about just the time and effort it takes to generate evidence and how broad-reaching it might be, that's why the alignment is important. That's why keeping a living document updated is critical, again, so that efforts can be streamlined and efficient.
And resources can be optimized. So.
Agreed.
Excellent. And so how does the medical narrative take into consideration global versus regional needs?
So the medical narrative is intended to be a global story, meaning that you never want to find yourself in a position where one part of the globe or a different region is telling a different story than another region. This can lead to several contradictory messages going out, different resources being used in different ways that might contradict each other, redundancies, etc. However, that's not to say that the story will remain exactly the same for each region. So the medical narrative is built in such a way where you can add in the regional nuances that are necessary to make the narrative complete. It's having global oversight and alignment from a broad strategy perspective and ensuring that you take into the local and regional considerations or maybe the local and regional needs that may be different from the global side, but fitting it into one document such that there is alignment across the entire organization.
Great. And are there legal reasons to keep medical affairs separate from other functions, for example, sales?
Definitely. So medical affairs, there's a strong firewall because medical affairs should be medically and clinically focused rather than numbers driven. Medical affairs is focused on ensuring that the unmet medical needs are disseminated, as we talked about before, but more importantly, they're gathering the insights early in development to understand what those needs are and how they can bring that and integrate it back into the organization to meet those clinical and medical needs. Sales is focused on an entirely different set of attributes and is focused on these attributes after launch. So we see that the value of medical affairs is really coming in early and bringing in the insights that are medically and clinically focused.
Agreed, and it's also important to recognize that there are laws against talking about products that don't have a labeled indication. And when you're talking about products in development and you're trying to understand unmet medical need in the community, that's peer-to-peer exchange in the scientific community. And that's actually the underlying premise of why medical affairs is an important, well-positioned function to be able to have that two-way dialogue peer-to-peer in the medical community and bring insights back. This would not work if the functions sat within the same organizational structure and were commingled with sales. So it's critically important that there is a distinction there.
Excellent. And what are some of the concrete metrics used to measure the impact of medical affairs?
That is a webinar topic all its own. So the concrete measurements that we use for medical affairs, and I'll just talk about the ones that we've covered today, is ensuring that the medical community has an awareness of the unmet medical needs, ensures that there's some insights coming in that are actionable. That's another metric that can be used to think about medical affairs and the value that they're bringing to an organization, and also how they're disseminating data in the most efficient way. So these are some of the metrics, but there are several others that, like I said, we can spend an entire webinar on.
Thank you. So we have time for one last question. Can the medical narrative work in any size organization?
Absolutely. So the medical narrative is very important for smaller organizations because it aligns the entire organization around the medical and clinical benefit. But even beyond that, as Susan talked about earlier, it starts to align the resources and the investments that are made throughout the evidence generation plan and or life cycle. For a large organization, that alignment is even more crucial because you have multiple functions within the medical affairs broader organization that are working on several different aspects of it, and that's just sticking within medical affairs. So when you start going beyond medical affairs, that alignment becomes less and less obvious. The medical narrative can act as this unifying document across all functions and organizations of all sizes to ensure that everybody is going after the same types of priorities that are housed within the medical narrative.
Well, thank you so much. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I want to thank the audience for attending and participating in today's event. I would also like to thank our sponsor, Syneos Health, for making today's educational webcast possible. As a friendly reminder, concluding today's event, we invite you to participate in a brief survey from our sponsor. This survey will automatically appear on your screen. Today's webcast will be available for on-demand viewing through January of 2019. You will receive an email from Pharmaceutical Executive alerting you when this webcast will be available for replay. We invite you to forward that announcement to any colleagues who may have missed today's live event. And thanks again. We will see you next time. Bye-bye.